Okay, the moment you've been waiting for. In this chapter, you're going to learn how pee is made. So, obviously, urine, you typically think of this waste product, right? So, kidneys produce urine as a waste. But there's a lot of other things our kidneys are doing for us. And this is the chapter where it's not only about making urine, but it's about making sure the blood has everything it needs. It doesn't have too much of something or not enough of something. So your basic topics include general functions of the urinary system. We're going to look at some gross anatomy of the urinary system, so kidneys, ureters, urinary bladder, and urethra. We take a look at the inside of a kidney. All right, so we call that the internal anatomy of the kidney. We'll look at some different regions inside the kidney. We'll talk about where urine comes from and where it flows. So obviously it'll eventually go into toilets, but how does it get there? We're going to talk about blood flow into the kidney, within the kidney, and then back out of the kidney. And the blood flowing in is the blood that needs to be cleaned up and regulated. And then the blood coming out of that kidney hopefully is in perfect shape. We're going to talk about the functional units of a kidney known as nephrons. So in order to know how a kidney works, you have to know how a nephron works. A kidney is basically just a package of millions of nephrons. Once we look at the structure, we'll look at the function, and then we look at neural and hormonal regulation of kidneys. So what does the nervous system do to your kidneys? What are some of the hormones that are controlling the kidneys? And then we'll look at urine. Basically, what does normal urine look like? What's in it? Then we'll look at anything that might, be a red flag as far as abnormalities, things that should not be in urine. So let's take a look at the basic functions. Now, again, most of you know that urine is a waste material, right? So we excrete urine, and what's in that urine is often things that are waste products. We call those metabolic wastes. So those are wastes just produced during a number of chemical reactions that occur in the body. If that waste molecule accumulated, it could be toxic, so we have to get rid of it. This could also include the excretion of foreign things that might, if allowed to accumulate, could cause damage. So medications or drugs, toxins, not all of them, but certain drugs and toxins can be excreted from the body. And then you'll notice a lot of the next few functions are all what we call regulation. So what we mean by regulation is the kidney's going to get blood. It's going to look at all the different components and decide whether there's too much of something and get rid of it, or if there's not enough of it, we have to at least keep as much in the blood as possible. So we do this with ions, so sodium, potassium, calcium, chloride, so on and so on, are regulated by kidneys. pH is a big one. pH is a really important topic in this chapter as well as in the next chapter. So kidneys are going to help make adjustments if necessary to the pH of your blood. How they do it is they will get rid of the hydrogen ions or protons. Remember, this is what makes an acid an acid, the release of hydrogen ions. So if your blood becomes acidic, we can adjust that by getting rid of these hydrogen ions. We also want to try to maintain the buffer. So the most important buffer in your bloodstream is bicarbonate. So if we can get rid of the hydrogen ions and keep the buffer, that's a good way to maintain blood pH. Then we can regulate volume and pressure. Remember, those two are related, right? If you have too much blood volume, you could have a high blood pressure. If you have low blood volume, you could have low blood pressure. So the kidneys can function in blood pressure regulation by retaining or eliminating water and therefore adjusting the blood volume. Another connection to blood pressure is the activation of the RAA system. So kidneys trigger that system. by releasing renin. And remember, renin is going to ultimately result in angiotensin production, which vasoconstricts and increases pressure, and aldosterone, which retains sodium and water. So again, very close connection with regulating blood pressure. Kidneys do produce two hormones. Erythropoietin we talked about in the blood chapter, so that's going to help stimulate red blood cells. Calcitriol is active vitamin D. So your kidneys can help in the production of vitamin D, and then it can also help stimulate red blood cells. And then the last thing on my list here is gluconeogenesis. So this is the production of glucose, typically in a kind of an emergency situation. If you're super low in glucose, right, you can make some glucose from other non-carbohydrate molecules, like certain amino acids. And that's a function of both your liver and kidneys. But that's only going to be done, if you're going, a while without food, prolonged fasting, and your blood sugar is super, super low. Your kidneys and liver can produce glucose from other molecules. So that's kind of the list. We're going to start with gross anatomy. So this is a picture showing, obviously, kidneys here and here. You'll notice that the right kidney is actually situated a little lower than the left, and that's because it needs to make room for a liver, right? Your liver is going to be occupying a lot of this upper right quadrant, which kind of pushes down on that right kidney. So obviously they're producing the urine. So they got to get blood. They get blood from the aorta by way of the renal arteries. That blood flows through the kidney. It gets cleaned up. We remove anything from the blood that is in excess or might be waste, and we produce urine. That nice clean blood exits the kidney in the renal veins and enters the inferior vena cava. The urine gets transported down using ureters. These are just transport tubes that bring the urine into the urinary bladder. So they kind of attach to the back of the bladder and start to fill that bladder with urine. Once that bladder gets to a certain volume, it's going to trigger a nervous system response to help notify you that it's time to go to the bathroom, but also stimulate that bladder to contract so we can eliminate the urine from the bladder through the urethra. All right. So that's your basic gross anatomy. This is another view kind of showing the position of the kidneys. So this is the back of the body. This is the anterior of your abdomen. So this would be a transverse section, right? We see a spinal cord in there and a vertebra. And then we see the kidneys. Now notice they're sitting in the back. They are known as retroperitoneal because they lie behind the peritoneal cavity. Here's the cavity. See a little bit of the liver. I added that, there's going to be intestines and the stomach in here as well. And we do see little parts of some of those. But there's the cavity, peritoneal cavity. Kidneys are situated behind it. Kidneys are protected. We do protect a little bit with ribs, a little bit with muscle, and also with adipose tissue. So there's a nice layer of protective fat that surrounds each kidney. And then again, we see the blood flow, renal artery going in, renal vein coming out. So just another view showing the position of those kidneys. This is our interior anatomy drawing. So obviously this is kind of the exterior of the kidney, showing the indentation known as the renal hilum. This is where things are either entering or exiting a kidney. So blood has to enter, so you got a renal artery. Blood has to leave, so you have a renal vein. Urine has to leave, so you have a ureter coming out of there. You're also going to have lymphatics, because you got to have a lymphatic system in there. So a lymphatic vessel will come out of there. You got to have nerves, so nerve will go in there. So if you're going in or out of a kidney, you're right at that indentation called the renal hilum. When we look at the inside of the kidney, there's an outer layer called the renal cortex. So that's this layer out here. You see some little blood vessels out there. It kind of goes down towards the center there of the kidney and forms these columns, which separate out what's known as the renal medulla, which is made up of renal pyramids. All right, so notice that these are kind of triangular. They're actually pyramid-shaped structures, and those are called renal pyramids. They're found in this kind of layer here called the medulla. So if you were to point to one of these, you'd be right by saying it's the renal medulla. You'd also be right if you said it's a renal pyramid. So the renal pyramids make up the renal medulla, which is this area below the cortex. Then from those pyramids, and we'll talk about how this is all done, the urine kind of drips down through little tubes into these little cups. So at the tips of these pyramids, and the tip of the pyramid is called the renal papilla, is where urine kind of drips out. All right, so there's microscopic structures in here called nephrons, and they're all making a little bit of urine at a time. So you got to collect that in the calyxes. A calyx collects the urine. It starts to drain into this area, kind of behind these blood vessels, is known as the renal pelvis. And once the urine enters the renal pelvis, it can exit using the ureter. All right. So we definitely want to know what the cortex is, what the pyramids are, what a calyx is. So we have what we call minor, and then major is where they kind of merge together. And then the pelvis ends up leading to the ureter. Pelvis is where you often find kidney stones. So if someone has a history of kidney stones, those are usually little calcium crystallizations that occur and form in that renal pelvis. So that's the internal anatomy. Reviewing a little bit about the flow. Now, we don't know how it's made yet, but it's going to be made using the nephrons. So again, we call a nephron the functional unit of a kidney. There's about 1 million of them. They're small and microscopic, so we don't see them on this drawing, but they're all in there. And they're all producing small amounts of urine that gets collected in the minor calyx, that is basically at the very tips of those pyramids. That goes into a bigger region called a major calyx, which is basically where two minors merge together. So on this drawing, I would say that right here's a major calyx, where here and here are the two minors situated at the bottom of those pyramids. Then from the major calyxes, it goes into the pelvis. That's basically where this urine name right there is. And that allows it to exit the ureter. The ureter is going to use gravity, a little bit of pressure. So as you make more urine, the pressure kind of drives the urine flow. And then ureters also have peristalsis. There's a little bit of muscle that can help push the urine down. Then it enters the bladder. It's going to fill the bladder. All right, at some point that bladder is going to stretch, activate a nervous system response so you know that you have to urinate. And then we can stimulate that bladder to excrete the urine through and out the urethra. And then here it says external environment. Hopefully that involves a toilet. But it could involve, I guess, a tree if someone goes and pees on a tree, or hopefully not their underwear. Okay, so that's the first video. Let's see. Let's maybe talk about the difference between the male and female urethra. This is going to be reviewed again in the reproductive system, but one difference between a male and a female is the length of the urethra. A male's urethra is about 5 times longer than a female's because it has to go through a prostate gland, and then it goes through the length of the penis. So the internal urethral sphincter, where urine enters, is right here. Then it's got three areas. It's got a prostatic urethra because it goes through the prostate gland. There's a short little region called the membranous urethra. And then when it goes the length of the penis, it's called the spongy urethra. And we'll learn why it's called spongy. You'll notice the tissue that surrounds it kind of looks spongy. All right, and that's part of the erectile tissues of the penis. And then at the end, or the terminal end of the penis, is the external urethral orifice. Female is much shorter. All right, so the internal orifice is here, external orifice here. Another difference is males use the urethra for reproduction as well. So that's obviously going to be part of the path of semen as well as urine. All right, that's probably a good place to not stop. We're going to talk about the Micturition reflex. So the Micturition reflex, micturition means urination. It's a reflex, so that suggests that there's some nervous system involvement as well as some involuntary involvement. Okay, so kind of like defecation, a lot of that response is involuntary, but you can control it because you have a voluntary sphincter. Remember, when it came to defecation, they were the anal sphincters. Here we're looking at urethral sphincters. So bladder starts to fill. All right, urine fills the urinary bladder. The urinary bladder has stretch sensors. All right, so in that wall of the bladder, all right, there are stretch sensors. Those are attached to the sensory neurons. So they're shown here as pelvic nerves. All right, those send the signal into the sacral spinal cord. So at the bottom of the spinal cord is where those neurons enter. All right. The reflex, notice there's a quick reflex, sends parasympathetic activity out. The parasympathetic nerves are going to stimulate the muscle of the bladder. It's smooth muscle, involuntary, known as the detrusor muscle. So the detrusor muscle is the smooth muscle of your bladder that contracts in response to parasympathetic stimulation. All right? That's going to produce pressure and start to move the urine through that urethra. At the same time, there's a internal urethral sphincter that's going to relax. Then, if you need to consciously control your urination, aka postpone it, we have to send a signal down from your brain. All right, so it starts at the cerebral cortex, travels down the spinal cord, comes out the sacral spinal cord in a somatic motor nerve, right? Not an autonomic. We want to use a somatic because that can control our skeletal muscle. And the skeletal muscle that we can control voluntarily is the external urethral sphincter. So if we want to postpone urination, we have to contract that sphincter. All right, so that's your basic Micturition reflex. Again, it's nervous system controlled. There's some involuntary component to it, parasympathetic nervous system. And then there's some voluntary component from the somatic nervous system. That's a good place to stop. Next video, we're going to start looking at blood flow and start to get into those functional units called nephrons.